Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this afternoon on the pros and cons of disaster recovery as a service. We are about 1 minute to the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started in about 1 minute and let some folks roll in. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started today. For the folks who have joined us on the phone, certainly we're going to leave some time at the end of the presentation for any questions you might have. But if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to submit them through the questions pane on the right-hand side of your player, and we will go ahead and get to those as best we can during the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. Also, we are going to be recording this webinar today, so we will send out the webinar recording to all of you on the phone as well following the webinar, along with a copy of the slide deck and some supplemental handouts that we think will be very useful regarding this topic. So joining us today on our webinar on the pros and cons of disaster recovery as a service on your 6 steps towards IT resiliency, we're going to be featuring Jason Buffington, who is our principal analyst at Enterprise Strategy Group, who has a wealth of knowledge in the data protection space. He's going to be covering 6 steps to how you can get toward an IT resiliency mindset and the pros and cons of disaster recovery as a service if you're looking at that. Joining us today also from Carbonite is our own Shaun Sellers, who's a Senior Product Manager here at Carbonite, who's going to be managing a lot of the products we've got up and coming in the DRaaS space. So without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Jason. Jason, take it away.
Thanks so much, and sincerely thank you to Carbonite for having me today. My name is Jason Buffington. I'm the Principal Analyst at ESG. I've been in the data protection space for 28 years. Predominantly in backup, a little bit of replication, a little bit of DR as well, and hopefully you also follow me on Twitter as jbuff. Joining with me today, longtime colleague and friend Shaun Sellers. Shaun, say hi.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm a product manager here at Carbonite, and I've been with the company for probably over 14 years now, and also have a history with backup and DR. My primary areas of responsibility are our Linux availability product and our upcoming DR as a service solution that you'll see more about or hear more about in the upcoming months.
Very good. So with that, we're here today to talk about DRaaS or BCDR and all the concepts related to the proactive assurance of IT availability. Wrote a book back in 2010, and I'll tell you the first words on chapter 1 and the last words in the last chapter are what you see on the screen. Get your data out of the building, right? One of the biggest problems that we see more often than not in BCDR type considerations is people get so busy thinking about the plan and all of its grandioseness and the 3-ring binders and the workflows and the conversations and the interviews, and all of that is important. And they get so busy doing that when the disaster strikes, they haven't actually done anything yet, which means they're frankly just as down as if they'd never done anything at all. And so I would tell you, first things first, get your data out of the building, right? Because at least if you do that, then eventually you can roll up your sleeves and get back to doing business ideally, and then you have more latitude to kind of start really thinking about what today's topic is as the pros and cons of DRaaS. In that, we're going to talk about 6 different things. We're going to talk about SLAs, site selection, where DRaaS fits and where it doesn't, mechanisms, strategies, some organizational considerations. Along the way, I'm hoping that Shaun will pile on now and then as far as what Carbonite is seeing as well, and then we're going to give Carbonite a few minutes at the end to kind of also make sure you're up to date on their offerings as well. Now, if we start off, though, I'll tell you honestly, pros and cons, it's a good topic as a title of a webinar. I'll tell you that from my perspective, there's not really many cons per se. There's a few things that you got to think about, but I would just tell you that as opposed to before and after or good versus bad, let's just talk about what to look for when you're thinking about DRaaS as part of your strategy. First things first, first thing I'd offer to you for consideration is SLA should drive the strategy, not vice versa. There are too many organizations where IT thinks about their broader range of strategy for IT, but doesn't really listen to the needs of the business as far as what the expectations of uptime and downtime are. And when you do that in reverse, you're almost bound to disappoint not only the business units, but certainly also senior executive leadership as well. Now, if you start with what are the SLAs, what are the expectations of uptime and downtime across environments, one of the first things that I'll tell you is, you know, ESG's been doing this a long time. I've been doing this for nearly 3 decades, and for most of that time, folks have terms like business critical and mission critical and high priority and normal and low priority. All of those subjective terms are really up for, they're relative to the business, right? If I told you, hey, I've got one server that's responsible for most of the legal team and another server that's responsible for the shipping department, you might presume that maybe the legal team has a higher priority than the shipping department until you realize the shipping department is for Amazon.com and their stuff is pretty important, right? So if you get, but let's go ahead and standardize on two taxonomies for a couple of these data points. First being that idea of high priority being any term that you want to use for more than normal. Heroics. And what I would point out to you is that when you look at those more than normal heroics, you'll see that, yeah, the bell curve leans to the left, right? So we have a significant portion. If I look at the left 3 columns, so an hour or less of tolerable downtime for high priority applications, we get 22, 44, 51%, so about half of the high priority servers within an environment have a downtime of an hour or less. But I think just as important is look at how the basic bell curve shape of that bloom is not that much different for high priority applications than it is for normal applications. Yes, you should expect something to shift to the right, but it's not as significantly varied as it used to be. Shaun, you said that you've been at DoubleTake for 14 years. I recall when DoubleTake was first coming into the business, it seemed like the high priority applications were somewhere in the neighborhood of 2, 3, 5% of server infrastructure. And for those at the time, before y'all came into market, you were really looking at SRDF and clustering as really the only way to have better than typical protection. And on the far right-hand side of that extreme, you might find some things where nightly tape was good enough, and certainly DoubleTake filled a gap in between there. Today, on average, most organizations would define somewhere between 20 and 25% of their infrastructure as high priority as opposed to normal. So certainly we're seeing a more normalization of workflows, but more importantly, we're not seeing near the delta of effort. Every server is perceived as high priority, at least according to the data. Shaun, what are you seeing from that?
Well, I think a lot of customers will say that all the data is equally important, but when it comes to spending the money and the resources, they'll have second thoughts. And I think the sweet spot that we see typically is what you're representing here in the slide, is that 15 minutes to an hour range, which is where Carbonite replication fits. You know, it's a very similar technology, does with real-time replication, so it provides a cluster-like solution.
Okay, that works for me. So what if we take off the terms? What if we get rid of the words like high priority versus normal and just look at what percentage of servers fall within a variety of SLAs? So that's kind of our next viewpoint on this. And this kind of reiterates that that discussion we had earlier on the normalization of data. If you look at the percentage of servers that have downtime, and Shaun, you mentioned the 15 minutes or less range, and that comes down to about 46% of servers have that 15 minute or less SLA. Now this is a target SLA. This isn't actually so this is aspirational. This is not necessarily the real world that folks struggle to live in right now. But I do think it's interesting to find that about half of all servers have a downtime tolerance of 50 minutes or less. About 3 out of 4 have a downtime tolerance of 2 hours or less, and 7 out of 8 have a downtime tolerance of 6 hours or less. And I think why this is really important, and I actually want to fast forward a little bit, this is actually the 2017 research that ESG recently completed, and we actually have been tracking this kind of interest and aspiration over the last couple years. If you look at what it was 2 years ago, in fact, we can kind of see the table over on that right-hand side. Over the last 2 years, the expectation of 15 minute or less downtime has gone from 35% of servers across a given organization up to 46%. The expectations of 2 hours less has gone from 67% of servers up to 74%, so again, a slight increase. The 2 to 6 hour range is relatively flat, and of course you can see the stragglers, the legacy stuff sitting on that right-hand side has gone from, so what is that, from 16 down to 12% of servers. It should be 14 down to 12% along the way. So we're seeing a gradual, continued evolution and shift to that left-hand side where, as Shaun mentioned earlier, all servers have a higher level of expectation of uptime than what we've ever seen before. And Shaun queued it up very nicely when he talked about replication. For the servers that you have that are in that 15-minute or less range, that is not the domain of backup, right? It just isn't. You can't do a backup and say, I can recover in 15 minutes or less, because this is going to take you longer than that to decide. Right? That data already has to be there so that when you do an invocation, we're measuring that in single-digit minute or less. In fact, arguably, if the only thing you're doing is traditional architecture backup, even that 2 hour or less range of SLAs is hard for folks to try to accomplish. In fact, when we ask about that, in the ESG research, here's what we found is the blue lines are what we showed on the last screen. It's the percentage of servers that have each of the following SLA expectations. The yellow, most folks think that VMs are probably the more agile method of recovery than, say, physical servers or cloud instantiated servers. So if we look at VMs, which is our best case scenario, we can see what is the actual length of time necessary to bring VMs back up online. And you'll see that yellow curve is starkly far to the right of where it needs to be in order to meet those SLAs, which is why, from an ESG perspective, we talk about a range of data protection activities. We refer to it as a spectrum, right? So the colors here are intended to kind of describe, when was the last time that you went outside and you saw a rainbow in your backyard, and one of the colors was missing from that rainbow. That doesn't happen because one color doesn't replace another. They are meant to complement. And similarly, we expect that for most IT organizations, you should be complementing, not supplementing or not replacing. You should be complementing traditional backups, which is still the brick and mortar of any data protection architecture, with archiving, with snapshots, with replication, and with availability mechanisms. And when you take those 5 mechanisms and you combine them with corporate culture and executive sponsorship, then we get business outcomes like e-discovery preparedness, regulatory compliance, business continuity, disaster recovery, et cetera. But it starts with a multicolored foundation of data protection mechanisms in order to meet the SLAs that organizations are having. Shaun, can I get an amen on that one?
Amen.
All right. All right, so that's how SLAs work. So we should be working at SLAs driving the strategy, not vice versa, and then that's going to drive what kind of behaviors and mechanisms that you're going to use. Second thing we want to, I would encourage you to think about is think about what kinds of sites and also what kind of data transports should you be thinking about as part of a DRaaS or any other kind of BCDR type strategy. So we asked about that in some recent data, and again, the data is meant to hopefully, folks on the call today, you can kind of put yourself in, okay, where do I fit related to what, in this case, 391 other IT professionals have responded to as well. Now, this data is a little complicated, so let me unpack it for you. So we asked about what kind of mechanisms or sites are you using for your DR strategy today. If you used it anywhere in your environment, you pick the blue line. And as you can see, most organizations have more than one mechanism for BCDR, right? So more than half of organizations say, yeah, there's a cloud service as part of it, and yeah, we have a secondary center that we use for part of it, and yeah, we'll use tapes as part of it as well. That's the blue lines. What I think is probably just as interesting, though, or probably more meaningful, is when you only get to pick one. That's the yellow and the green. The yellow is if you only get to pick one, what's your primary BCDR method in use today? And then what's your expected primary method of BCDR 24 months from now? And I think that tells a more interesting story because you can see, again, it's still fairly evenly matched, right? About 1 in 4 organizations, give or take a few points, are leveraging a cloud-based DR service, that's DRaaS, or they're managing using, they own and operate their own secondary data center. And we still see a little bit of a lag behind that in They lease space, and that could certainly be also IaaS-based infrastructure as well, or a traditional DR partner. In fact, the only one that really has a significant delta on this is that, yes, we're expecting the tape will radically decline as a method of DR. Does tape go away? No. It absolutely does not. Not in 2017, not in 2018. There absolutely still is a place for tape as it relates to long-term retention for preservation purposes. But as far as DR and survivability of data, more and more that's going to be a disk and cloud-first world, and we expect to see that to continue to move on those
Jason,
momentum.
I'm curious to know, are you seeing any trends with the types of businesses that are leveraging cloud-based services specifically, or are they on the smaller end of company size, maybe startups?
That's a fair question. Yeah, so it's not necessarily based on company size. It is in part based on company age. So certainly for companies that are 10 years old or less, where most of their infrastructure is cloud native already, certainly it's easy for them to presume, well, why wouldn't I use the cloud for my DR solution as well? When we look at the longer, more established companies, now size starts to become a little bit of a factor in that for small and medium businesses, they should probably go to the cloud, do not pass go, do not collect $200 all day long. For large enterprises, the amount of data that they have often forces them to think about a self-managed secondary center first. And in fact, what we often see, in fact, I remember DoubleTake used to talk about this as a bow tie, where all of the servers, say, on the West Coast might come to a West Coast data center and then go to the East Coast for DR. Meanwhile, the East Coast servers go to the East Coast data center and then they go to the West Coast for DR. Kind of gives you that nice little bow tie kind of imagery there. And so for those places where the enterprises already have multiple sites of presence, we expect that they'll continue to self-manage more than not, just based on the rate of scale, except for when the data is distributed, right? So if I'm talking about a large enterprise, but a vast majority of that data is, say, robo or broadly distributed, as long as IT is driving the process and the strategy, if the secondary users are not in the same geo as the primary users, then cloud is just as viable as if they had done a secondary site themselves. So there's a lot of pivot points as far as there's not a single best answer to fit, other than age of company tends to show a predilection towards cloud.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yep, absolutely. Thanks.
Certainly cloud comes in a lot of different forms along the way, but one of the things we do find that's rather interesting is when we look at how cloud fits into as an infrastructure strategy, we ask this question every year as part of tracking where the money goes in a report that ESG calls IT spending intentions. And for I think the 4th year in a row, the #1 intended use case for cloud-based infrastructure is as a repository for backup or archive. So that in many cases translates as cloud-based storage as a supplement to on-premise backup, replication, or archival technology. But certainly you can see from the at 400 responses, 2% delta, that N is relatively flat, that disaster recovery is also a core location. In fact, kind of going back again to the DoubleTake within Carbonite early days, we saw 15 years ago when virtualization was first on the scene, there were a lot of organizations, including vendors, that said, hey, you probably don't want to run your most important applications in a VM yet. And what organizations found, though, was they said, okay, so maybe I don't want to run production apps in a VM. I sure wouldn't mind failing over to it, though. And so I remember DoubleTake and some of your competitors who have long since retired and dried up, you would replicate farms of physical servers into VMs. And then what people found was when you failed over into those VMs, they said, you know what, this stuff runs pretty well in a VM. Maybe I could run in production. And I would argue that these kinds of backup and replication mechanisms, DoubleTake being one, was actually an accelerant towards the consideration of virtualization in production. I think we're seeing the same thing in the case of cloud-based infrastructure 15 years later. It's not going to take as long. But the idea of being able to replicate and dynamically move from an agility perspective in and out of cloud, I think is going to, where DR and backup are the first and easy low-hanging use cases, will actually accelerate consideration of cloud-based infrastructure for production applications as well. And I think that's an exciting thing that the folks at Carbonite are actually part of. Let me kind of hone in on it a little bit, though. So this is looking at cloud infrastructure for its own sake. If we look at the cloud-based methods used as part of a BCDR strategy, we see a variety. We see, and again, blue is check all that might apply. Yellow is what's the expected primary when you can only pick just one. And of those, we see a perk, actually, excuse me, that's the last slide. This one is blue is what methods are in use today, all of them. The yellow is what's the primary expected method over the next 2 years, so a little variant on that. DRaaS is, all three of them have at least 50% consumption use today. However, 41%, 2 out of 5 organizations expect that using a managed service provider and actually having a turnkey kind of outcome for DR is actually they're expected. About 1 in 3 are going to actually do what we call DR through IaaS, meaning the infrastructure may be in a cloud, but it's actually self-managed and sustained. And then, you know, just for completeness of picture, certainly there are some organizations out there that are saying, look, I'm just going to start picking applications that are natively resilient as a cloud. So as an example, you know, for over a decade, DoubleTake and a few of your competitors have been replicating and failing over Exchange, right? Most people aren't going to fail over Office 365, right? So the idea of the Seattle servers for Office 365 go down, my mail client's going to connect to Atlanta, and I can't tell the difference. So certainly there's some folks out there that are going to be looking for applications that are natively durable, often offered as a SaaS with multi-points of presence, as part of their DR strategy for everything that can't be fulfilled using an IaaS or DRaaS type architecture. All right. Kind of a last bullet on this, just to kind of think about how should the cloud fit there. So it's great that the cloud magically exists out in the interweb, but how are you going to get your data out there? And I think it's interesting when we look at, okay, so what are the methods by which organizations are planning on moving data out into that cloud-based infrastructure? Software-based replication is the primary expected method for moving data into a BCDR-based environment. And you can see, again, the blue lines, all that might apply, software-based backups, and then also workload-based. So things like SQL transaction logs kind of come into play, Oracle transaction logs as well. But again, those, because they are workload-specific, you're going to still have to supplement that with something that covers the agnostic workloads that otherwise don't have it. So, Shaun, how do you feel about software-based replication being the #1 planned method of moving data for BCDR purposes?
Well, I really like that. I mean, that's where we can help from the Carbonite side. It's a good fit. It's agnostic from a technology perspective often, because it just kind of sits in the middle of the stack and can look up transparently to the application and look down transparently to the storage. So it's a good fit and a good technology for DR.
I would also offer that by using software-based replication, one of the key advantages is that, you know, we saw earlier that we weren't talking, when we look at the number of servers that require levels of agility and SLA availability that backup alone cannot suffice, because that is normalized. If you're picking just workload-specific mechanisms, I think it's harder to achieve that broad of a range. In this case, though, you look at virtualization, for example. You see a host has got 20 VMs on it. A couple of those VMs are going to run SQL, a couple more for Oracle, a couple more for Exchange, or whatever the core workloads are. If you're trying to apply a different replication mechanism that might be workload-specific for each, you're going to have a challenge normalizing that, particularly as VMs happily bounce between hosts and between data clusters. Instead, using a software-based replication mechanism can often be a way to say, look, regardless of what kind of data is in your environment, you actually can achieve the same level of SLAs simply because of the fact that you're using something that's lower than the application in those stacks. Can we get an amen?
Amen.
Okay. So we've talked about SLAs. We've talked about different kinds of sites and transports. Now let's kind of really hone in a little bit on why DRaaS should be part of it. We kind of teased a little bit along the way, but if we kind of look a little closer on why is DRaaS part of the conversation, or what would influence the BCDR sites or services that you're going to be consuming for this, I do think it's notable. Take a look at there's a significant blush on the top 4 reasons why organizations are picking BCDR versus the rest of the stack. So certainly increased security. Now I like this one. I mean, you can't have a conversation with cloud or about IT modernization without talking about cloud as part of it. And the first thing that anybody says when they want to object to cloud is security. And yet we found that in many cases, cloud-based security is actually higher. It's more robust. Data is encrypted in flight. Data is encrypted at rest than you might find in self-managed or all on-prem solutions. Economics often points people towards consideration of cloud. Improved reliability. The reality is, and not to hurt anybody's feelings on the call today, the servers running in an IaaS environment in a hyperscale cloud like Azure and Amazon probably do have a higher uptime than your servers. Yes, for large enterprises, you can get the same kinds of economy of scale in a software-defined data center or private cloud-type architecture. But for a vast majority of organizations, yeah, they're going to have a higher uptime. And so the idea of having that as your copy of last resort becomes powerful, and then performance comes along with that. And then you see a waterfall that starts to follow through with that. So when you start looking at that, cloud as part of a DR strategy, as that infrastructure of last resort starts to become increasingly appealing. If we look at what does that look like in reality today, from a DRaaS perspective, about half of organizations said, yep, DRaaS is part of our existing solution today. Doesn't mean it's their #1 strategy. Doesn't mean that DRaaS has taken over the world. But it does mean that, yes, about half of all organizations have DRaaS for at least some of their workloads today. In fact, if you kind of round that out, going clockwise around the board there, another 12% of organizations say, we're not using it today, but we plan to. That big green wedge on the left-hand side, we're not using it, but we're interested. And perhaps maybe the other way to look at that is those folks are all warm to it, currently planning to or interested in. If you look at that little bitty orange wedge in the upper left-hand corner, 9%, or the other way to say that is 1 out of 11 environments are saying no to DRaaS. And I got to tell you, and Shaun, I'd love to hear your feedback on this, when 1 out of 11 folks are saying no, that by definition means at least 9.5 out of 11 folks are saying yes or maybe. That's a mainstream alternative by most definitions. And so that's one more point as to why most organizations ought to at least be considering where DRaaS fits within their architectures. What are you seeing from your customers as far as interest in DRaaS moving forward?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of interest primarily for some of the reasons you've already mentioned. They want to offset some of their resources, or augment their resources. They're smaller businesses, so a lot of companies are definitely looking at DRaaS. The ones that are not are maybe ones that are more concerned about their data sovereignty or managing and ownership of their data. So that's kind of our view.
That works. It also matches up with what we're seeing from recognized benefits. So when we ask folks that are currently using DRaaS as part of the model, here's what they said. Now this is kind of like, so I've got 3 kids, right? 2 of them are above driving age. 1 of them is not. But I remember back a few years ago, I would ask the kids, hey, what do you think is going to be great about having a car? And they gave me all kinds of really weird examples, like, oh, I'll be able to stay out until 4 o'clock in the morning, and I can hang out on weekends. And those aren't actually real. But when you ask 15-year-olds about the benefits of something they have really no experience with, you get a whole bunch of wacky answers. If you ask somebody who's on this call, who actually has been an adult for a while, you get realistic responses because you're looking at things retro as opposed to forecasted. So when we ask folks that are currently using cloud-based DR services, what they're getting out of it, I think this tells some interesting stories. Their RTO does improve. They do get increased levels of agility. Number 2, they get improved security. Remember, we talked about that earlier, as they start to realize when you look at cloud-based technologies, encryption at rest, encryption at flight, least common privilege at each point along the way from access control, you do actually likely get an improved level of security in many architectures. Along the same way,
Jason,
they get some
sorry to interrupt. I was wondering maybe if we could dig into the security topic a little bit more. Is that being driven from your point of view mostly for preserving and protecting their data from data breaches, or is it to meet compliance and regulatory needs, or what's really driving that, or maybe a combination of both?
Yeah, so it's a combination of both, and I think it depends on what altitude you're thinking about. If you think about just the mechanisms, think about just traditional backup as an example, so the far-fetched first line. In a traditional on-prem backup architecture, you put an agent on the front box, you're sending data across a wire that's typically unencrypted because it's in your own data center, so why would you bother adding tax to that? And then you've got that to a localized target. Well, immediately you've got data sniffer problems, which if you really want to know how prevalent that is, go ask Sony. You know, once you're in the walls, you're in, right? Along the same lines, you have physical access problems. If somebody walks away with the data protection target, including, you know, an on-premise replication target, in many cases that means they actually have all of your data, again, not typically in an encrypted state. In traditional backup, it's surprising how few organizations still don't leverage the encryption of tape media, et cetera. So there's the mechanisms that ensure safe transit and storage of data, and then there's the processes that folks are having to lay on top. The mechanisms are what we're seeing here, in that because cloud has always had these concerns and objections, it has been an emphasis of the cloud providers for years to say, okay, what else can we do to improve the security controls and dissuade the objections? Along with that, what we often find, to the rest of your question, is that when organizations intentionally start reimagining their data protection and their IT operations production capabilities. When they do that, what they often decide is, okay, as long as we're reimagining things, where else can we drive improvement along the way? And improving the security processes associated with data handling often come into that as well. Sometimes that's voluntary, sometimes that's reactionary to things like regulatory compliance as well. But there's a couple different tiers as far as how you have to layer security on top of that. But I love the fact that for organizations using cloud, the fact that the security mechanisms are often superior to what's done on-prem, I think is worth noting. And then you'll also see similar to that in your question, you know, number 4 is improved compliance, which also often comes from that as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. If we look at what factors are driving people towards cloud-based DR, it's a slightly different lens on this. Again, increasing recovery times based on that durability of data comes in top of the line. The ability to store pure data survivability, right? This goes back to your question earlier based on size of company. You know, smaller companies, mid-sized companies have always wanted the same level of IT resiliency that large enterprises have. The problem is they couldn't afford a secondary site and they didn't have the expertise. For many organizations, cloud normalizes both of those vectors, and so now you don't have to have a secondary site. You can take it to a cloud-based repository, and you don't need as much expertise because service providers and partners are much more competent than they were, you know, 10 years ago in helping as part of that solution. And then, yeah, you can start to eliminate some of, let's call it reduce, not eliminate, some of the backup hardware and software, and then perhaps get some economics. All right, time check. We're through 3 of the 6. We want to make sure we keep on going, give you a few more things that are actionable. One thing to point out is when we start looking at DRaaS, just like in traditional business continuity and disaster recovery, and I've been in that part of the market for a painfully long time, one of the questions that folks ought to be thinking about is what should fail over? And your hint here is not everything, right? So when we ask folks, what percentage of your servers have the ability to resume functionality from a BCDR site or from a BCDR service? Notice here there's not a huge portion of servers that says everything, right? Because probably not everything needs to, right? So there are still some mission-critical servers that have a higher level of SLA. The fun part is you don't know which servers in particular you're going to need at that secondary site. And so while you may only have the compute capability to fail over, say, 15, 20, 30, 40% of servers, and even those arguably should probably be staggered, right? So infrastructure servers first, and then thinking about some of the more complex applications, the back-end database, then the middleware, then the front-end proxies and portals, right? So there is some staggering that goes on into that. And then besides that, recognizing, you know, some servers really could have a day or 2 days of downtime before you start bringing them back up. But because you don't know which ones you need, you're going to likely have a disproportionate amount of servers protected, and yet have only a percentage of that be recovered at any point in time. Shaun, it's too bad that that there's not a technology out there that allows for orchestration and workflows so that you could automate these kinds of staggered or staged failovers. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we might be able to find one, and we probably will talk about it a little bit here towards the end of the presentation.
Fair enough. Way to tease the folks, pal. All right, number 5. So this is one that I want to soapbox on for just a second. When you're going to look at DRaaS or any other BCDR mechanism, one of the first things you ought to be thinking about is make sure that you're testing for red X's and not testing for green check marks. Here's what I mean by that. When we ask organizations what is the percentage of routine tests that fail, the extrapolated average, you can see there's a pretty wide spray here, is 63%. 63% of BCDR tests pass. Now, it would be easy to say 63%, oh my gosh, it's a failing score. I think that's not only passing, I think that's exceptional, and here's why. If you're testing when you're looking for green check marks, you're looking to pass, then really the only thing you're doing is trying to make the auditor happy, right, or the regulatory compliance person, because what you're looking for is you're looking for the lightest way to get through the test cycle and not be in trouble with your boss. And what will eventually happen is, and I hope folks maybe screenshot this, if you look for green check marks, you'll find them when you want them, but not when you need them, meaning you're not going to test very hard, and that means that when you actually need that data, you'll be surprised at what still goes wrong. As opposed to if you test looking for red X's, then you'll be able to find what is I need to optimize, what is I need to fix. Is it a run book? Is it an orchestration layer? Is there data I forgot to protect? 1 in 9 recoveries, by the way, fails because the data was never protected. 1 in 9. Right? I forgot to protect that new VM. I forgot to protect that new server. So if you're looking for red X's, you'll be able to fix what you need to so that you can recover when you want to. So always be looking for red X's. And make sure that you have executive and management support that understands that red X's are a good thing. All right, lastly, let's look at the who and how that affects the strategy as well. When we look at the roles and the groups that are affecting BCDR strategy, one of the most common problems that we see, especially with organizations that are first embracing DRaaS or rudimentary BCDR topics, is that the person in charge is the backup guy or gal. And the problem is that it would be very easy to assume that, hey, they know where all the servers are, they already protect all the data, especially when you're using like a replication technology. Surely they'll be able to handle this. But the problem is that just because you can back stuff up and recover it doesn't necessarily mean you understand the business processes that are necessary in order to ensure the recoverability of the organization at large. And in fact, when you look at the backup admins, you'll see it's a little under halfway down on the screen. The backup admins are actually only even at the table for planning and scoping of a BCDR strategy in less than 30% of organizations, and they're sitting at the head of the table only 7% of the time. In fact, the first thing I would tell you with BCDR is you're going to need a bigger table, right? Because the core folks that really ought to be part of that conversation, roughly half of the time, include IT operations, infrastructure folks, a VP of IT, CIO, and then you can see there's really a second tier of stakeholders, by the way, many of which have unique perspectives on either the business or the technology that really ought to be part of the conversation, right? From workload owners, from business line managers, et cetera. In fact, when we look at how large is the organization that actually is typically fulfilling for this, you'll see there's a peak here that typically you're looking at between 6 and 10 folks, plus or minus a few, as far as driving that strategy. It is not just, you know, the IT manager and their friendly neighborhood backup admin getting together every other Friday to figure out what the BCDR plan is. So plan for a bigger table. I'm going to kind of wrap this up a little bit by just kind of summarizing what I hope you should be looking for, and then we're going to give Shaun some time as well. If you let the SLAs drive the strategy, so first, if you start the conversation with the business units communicating with the IT folks on what are the expectations, what you will discover is backups alone are not enough, right? You will not meet those SLAs if the only thing you're working on is backup. There really is and ought to probably be more than one kind of recovery site. DRaaS is probably going to be part of the mix for a large set of organizations. Self-managed is there too, and so it sure would be nice if your technology worked equally well on both. Not everything is going to need to come up the day that something bad happens, but since you don't know what things are going to go down, be thinking about a broader protection strategy than you think, even if your recovery scenario isn't as broad as you might hope. And then lastly, you probably discovered that for many organizations, you've probably been testing incorrectly. Again, look for red X's over green check marks. Before any of that, two pieces of advice that I hope you write down, put on a Post-it note on your monitor. Get a bigger room. You're going to need more people than you think you are if you're really going to have a successful BCDR strategy, regardless of the size of your organization, because you need a broader and more diverse range of perspectives on the business and IT platforms if you're really going to have survivable infrastructure. And then lastly, I mentioned in the book is the first page is on page 1 and the last word's on the last page, so it's the same one for me on this webinar. Get your data out of the building. All right, first and foremost, do that, then you can do everything else afterwards. With that, I'm going to give it over to Shaun, and he's got a few things to say about the Carbonite answer to this. Shaun, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
All right, looks like I have control. So yeah, thank you, Jason. That was very insightful. Thank you to ESG. And I love the catchphrase there, get it out of the building. It's a great, simple call to action. So yeah, I'd like to just kind of wrap up today's session and just kind of give you an overview of Carbonite and who we are and what we have to offer. So we are a well-established company. We've been around for quite a while with across the combination of companies that have come together to form Carbonite. And if it wasn't obvious in the beginning, I came from DoubleTake, which Carbonite acquired DoubleTake earlier this year. So I'm responsible for that product line, or part of that product line. So we have 26,000 customers worldwide, and very high satisfaction rate, and we manage a significant amount of data that belong to our customers, 160 plus terabytes, and a huge channel with partners and value-added resellers and MSPs as well. I realized today that our topic are focusing on DRaaS, HADR, but I did want to point out we are also a data migration company, and we've done over 100,000 plus server migrations, often onboarding customers or helping them migrate into the cloud. So as Jason alluded to earlier, there's different solutions that would be a fit for your environment or application, and we'll talk about our two primary product lines, which Carbonite Backup and Disaster Recovery, and then Carbonite High Availability. But basically, these solutions cover cloud, virtual, physical systems, and on the Carbonite Backup side, we have good support for legacy systems, in addition to that spectrum of recovery times that you might need for your particular application. So kind of building on that, what we see here, if we kind of build on that mental model or that spectrum, or just breaking it down to simple three tiers, with the most critical being on the left, our high availability solution is the one that can provide that RTO in the matter of seconds or minutes, and RPO with no or minimal data loss. And then kind of moving to the far right is more traditional backup, which we'll dig into a little bit more in detail here in a bit, but that's your typical backup and recover on demand type of model, where recovery time is a little longer and you can back up a little more frequently, but it may take you longer to get the systems back up. And both solutions can kind of come together and actually work together in the middle to meet your different needs for your second tier systems. So let's talk about backup and disaster recovery first. This is our powered by eVault line. So this is our backup solution. It's very flexible from a deployment perspective, and we'll take a look at what the deployment models look like here next. But it offers very granular file level restore, entire system restores, whether they're physical machines or VMs, and we can recover bare metal because we also have the capability of not only backing up a file system like you would normally think of, we can do image level backups as well. And of course, in the vein or spirit of security, encryption is also available in flight. So as it's replicating from the protected server to the vault, it is secure, and you own the keys. And it's also secure in the vault as well. So we have kind of two models, multiple models of deploying this. So first we have, might be easier just to take a look at the pictures here, the visuals. You can deploy the solution in what we call a direct to cloud. So you would install the agents on your production machines on-prem, and then you would protect those and replicate to a vault in the cloud. You can have a hybrid model where you have an appliance that's a vault on-prem as well, so you back up locally, and then you back up as a secondary copy into the cloud. And then you can kind of build on that, and you basically have a chained or cascaded model here for Robo, where you have multiple branch offices replicating to your vault. Maybe they have a vault locally. You might have a vault at a central office, and then piggyback off of that with the cloud, so you have basically 3 copies. So very flexible, a lot of options on the flexibility of deploying that. And then on the double take side, this is the availability solution with the faster RTO and lower, more granular RPO. So faster failover, think of it as, I guess I like to describe it as RAID 1 mirroring, but but it's host-based software replication. We replicate data between your production server and a standby server, and that comes in the form of an availability product and the migration product that we call Move that I mentioned earlier, but let's just stay focused on availability. But this is a byte level replication product. It's replicating real time. As soon as the application writes, let's say 4 bytes, we're going to replicate that to the target server, and that'll be ready when you need it if there's a disaster that needs to be declared. So very minimal downtime, near zero downtime with sub-second recovery points, because the data is basically being replicated in real time. So it's very reliable as far as if you want to use it for maintenance. You can, not only have it there as a contingency for an outage, but you could use it for maintaining your servers. So if you needed to patch your production machine, for example, you could also manually switch the workload over to your backup server, and then apply maintenance to your production, and then switch back, and basically have a rolling maintenance model there. And just to give you a visual of what that looks like, and I kind of described it earlier, on the primary system, and it doesn't matter if it's physical, virtual, or cloud-based, we replicate that real time over to the target machine. Again, then on the target, that can be physical, virtual, or cloud-based. We basically, our strength is any to any, and you can go across dissimilar platforms. So you can go physical to cloud, cloud to physical, vice versa. And then looking towards the bottom here, if you have a failure, our software, the Carbonite availability, can automatically or manually, and most customers would like to have that manual control, switch the system over to the standby target system and be up and running very quickly. So that kind of wraps us up and brings us probably to our Q&A time. And I just want to throw this last slide up here. If you're interested in more detail on our product offerings, check out our website. Currently, the Double Take and eVault software products are on the eVault.com site, and then you can see our Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn tags there as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ethan and take us home for the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Shaun, and thanks again, Jason, for really good insights on this presentation. Hopefully, folks get a lot out of it on the phone. Once again, we will be we did record the webinar today, so we will be sending a recording to everyone following, along with the slide deck. If you have specific questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on eVault.com. you can send us a note right through the form on that site, and we'll make sure one of our technical support representatives gets in touch with you, even if you want a demo, if you're just looking for basic literature on sort of what the products can do. We're happy to help you in that regard. So with that, I know we're up against time, but we did have a couple of questions come in that I would like to kick over to either Shaun or Jason. The first one, which I think is interesting, and I know we touched upon it a little, we talked a lot about the benefits of DRaaS, but what are we seeing as the biggest objections to folks adopting DRaaS? Is it, are you seeing it as cost prohibitive, or are people not confident in the SLAs or the RTOs, RPOs that they're able to achieve with a cloud-based DR service, or is it the lack of infrastructure or bandwidth needed to carry out DRaaS? What are you sort of seeing as the biggest objections, and sort of how would you speak to those, or if you had to sort of sell this to an upper manager, how would you sell the benefits of DRaaS versus some of the objections?
Sure. I can start, and Shaun, if you want to pile on, you're welcome to. Probably the biggest objections come from, there's a wide range of folks that call themselves DRaaS providers, and if the only thing you're going to do is move a VM over to a cloud host and then turn it back on again, that's not really DRaaS. That's really IaaS, and the difference being, did you plan for the network? Right? So can you actually get seamless connectivity? Because it's not so much that the VM needs to turn back on, it's about the users need to resume productivity. And so there's a lot of DRaaS offerings where where either the network or the orchestration pieces are just plain lacking. The other challenge that we see for a lot of folks that are perhaps overly eager in jumping on all things cloud is that the cloud is not a silver bullet. The cloud will not, magically make all your problems go away. The cloud will not solve world hunger or world peace. The cloud is just another form of infrastructure, often with another economic model, hopefully combined with some level of superior expertise. And so there are some folks that they jump on cloud and they don't realize what the network burden from a cost perspective is going to be for data going in. Backup folks are notorious for just presuming the cloud is free because the wire already exists, and that's not true when you start, especially when you start pushing replication across the line. Also, egress charges. So the cloud can be a wonderful thing from a, I like what Shaun talked about earlier. Not all, not every server failover should be predicated on the primary site being underwater or on fire. If you have a blip, if you just want to migrate for maintenance purposes, whatever, it sure would be nice if you had agility, not just recoverability. The problem becomes that putting data into a cloud is far less expensive than pulling data back out of a cloud. And so some of the DRaaS and IaaS offerings really are kind of self-limiting in that it's very much a Hotel California model. It's easy to get in, hard to get out. And so that could be something of a challenge. And so we don't think that the on-prem brick-and-mortar data center is going away. There are reasons some data should lay on-prem, and in fact, there's some reasons you should have multi self-managed facilities. So those are kind of the overcorrection points. Is if you've overestimated that the cloud is just everything that you ever wanted, including Christmas. If you don't understand the networking topologies, and then lastly, there are some folks that don't realize that just because it's not running on your metal doesn't mean that you're not the one responsible for ensuring the success and recoverability. And so there's some folks that have some buyer's remorse afterwards because they don't realize you still need a level of expertise that not every service provider that purportedly offers DRaaS is able to give. So insight and expertise is another big one as well.
Yeah, I would say I would agree with all those things. We also see that security is a big issue. Customers that we've talked to, they ask a lot of questions about how the data is secure in flight or at rest, and in particular, what compliance gaps we can fill for them as far as their applications, and it depends on the vertical market that they're in. And then there's always ease of use, and whether or not it's a self-service solution or a managed service offering. A lot of customers like to be able to get in and do things on their own, but at the same time they want the ability to pick up the phone and call for help when they need assistance. So it's all about the service level and the customer satisfaction as well.
Great. Those are both really great points there. Another question came in, which I thought was interesting. Given the sort of prevalence or rise in cyber threats and cyber crimes and ransomware, how viable is DRaaS as a recoverability strategy from something like a cyber threat versus obviously it's pretty apparent that it would be useful in the event of a horrible hurricane or flood like we've seen a few times this year already. What's the sort of outlook for DRaaS in terms of its ability to handle ransomware?
Yeah, I guess
first, you want to take this one first?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and get us started, Jason.
All right.
Yeah, I guess what I see is that you have to look closely at the DRaaS offering. The primary goal is to get a server up and running in most cases with these solutions, but so you have to look at the secondary type of features, whether or not you can have multiple points in time. If you've captured a virus and had some sort of issue with your data, if it's some sort of logical corruption, if that gets replicated into your image in your cloud, you're just as broken in the cloud. So you have to have multiple recovery points. So that's something to look for in an offering, and maybe even go beyond that. You need to look for something that can do individual file recovery back to your on-prem, because a lot of times maybe you don't need to recover the entire image in the cloud. You want to be able to pull back a few files, what I'd like to call operational recovery, and get your on-prem system back up and running very quickly.
I'll pile on for that. First and foremost, if your malware or cyber security strategy is grounded in a data protection mechanism, backup, archive, replication, whatever, you kind of already lost. Cybersecurity really is about preventative on the front side, not about remediation from the back. So first and foremost, you want to have much more in the guarding on the front than just being able to retrieve from the back. That said, and I like Shaun said it perfectly. The challenge is that that most replication technologies, their primary goal is how fast can you get back up again. And in fact, one of the true differentiators is how frequently do you protect that data in order to have the least amount of data loss when you start to resume. That's the good news. The bad news is that means, as Shaun mentioned, if you get corruption or encryption on your primary data, milliseconds later, you will happily get encryption or corruption on the secondary copies as well. And so it becomes really important to have an air gap as part of that, so that so those kinds of infections are not immediately pervasive across the environment. It's one of the reasons why you need to complement replication and snapshotting with backups and other mechanisms as well, so that you don't have that pervasiveness of transmission of infections that go across the way. I would leave you with a note that and this isn't for Carbonite, this is for all the folks out there looking at all the backup solutions that are out there. If your backup vendor says, we can help you recover from malware, and the only thing they do is to restore your data, it's not really any different than we can help you from a hurricane. Yes, you can restore data. That's your job, right? So really, if you're going to help with going against malware, do you have automation? Can you do testing? Can you do analytics against a copy in a non-pervasive way? Can you create an air gap so that you have recoverable points in time that will not be pervasive in the infection? Can you do analytics, right? So one of the things that's interesting is when you sit down with the pro services folks from Carbonite, you'll find out that for most organizations, data change rates somewhere between 2 and 4% on a daily basis. If your metadata says that your data change rate is 2% daily, but all of a sudden your secondary target's getting 50% new data writes, you have been infected, right? So having some instrumentation and some insight as to the health of your data protection environment is a way to potentially flag for positive infection. Now you start to actually be part of the solution, and ideally do that as part of an integrated strategy, as part of monitoring and systems management. So there's certainly a lot more to it than just can I restore my data. Yes, you should have that, but let's make it part of a broader strategy where the front door is really guarded first, not just be proud of the back.
Great, excellent points. We're just about out of time, although I would like to give Shaun just a quick minute before we wrap up here to tell folks a little bit, because we did have a question come in about, does Carbonite have anything in the DRaaS space? Obviously we talked a lot about our HA and backup related products. Shaun, without revealing too much ahead of time, can you maybe give folks on the line here who are still with us a little bit of a preview of what's to come from Carbonite in the DRaaS space?
Absolutely. So yeah, in the next couple months, look for some things, exciting news to come out with regards to a new offering that we will have. And I'll just say that it's covers a lot of the bases here that we've talked about, and it does leverage some of our existing technology and a lot of orchestration sitting on top of that to make it very easy to use and get your servers up and running. So yeah, we're pretty excited about announcing this once it's finalized, but we are working hard to get this out real soon.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much. Thank you, Jason, for your great insights and feedback and research from ESG. Just another reminder for folks on the line, we will send you the recording and slides as soon as we can following this webinar. If you do have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us on evault.com. Shaun, thank you for your time today. I hope everybody has a great weekend, enjoy some of the nice weather out there, and we hope to catch you next time on our next webinar, which is going to be coming up on October 30th, right before Halloween, where Jason's going to be joining us again, and we're going to be talking about, more or less resiliency versus recovery type of mindset, and more around sort of having a complete, robust data protection strategy and sort of how to future-proof that. So we hope you all join us for that, and everybody have a great day. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.